Good afternoon, students. Today, we will be having a lesson analysis on The Blind Dog, written by R K Narayan.
The author of The Blind Dog is R K Narayan. R K Narayan was born in Chennai, India in 1906 and died in 2001. R K Narayan came from a humble South Indian background where he was consistently encouraged to involve himself into literature. Which is why, after finishing his graduation, he decided to stay at home and write. R K Narayan's decision of staying at home and writing was supported in every way by his family, and in 1930 he wrote his first ever novel called Swami and Friends, which was rejected by a lot of publishers. But this book was important in the sense that it was with this that he created the fictional town Malgudi. Narayan's writing style often involves telling tales which involve classic Indian culture or certain aspects of everyday life that are extremely relatable, often involving family members and close friends. He delivers his narrative with an artful and deceptive technique when dealing with such subjects, and does not entirely avoid them, rather letting the words play in the reader's mind. Furthermore, his works tend to be more descriptive and less analytical. The objective style, rooted in a detached spirit, providing for a more authentic and realistic narration. In short, his works often echo the sentiment of beauty and simplicity, and thus his writing is often simple, but yet has a deeper meaning that we will explore together. These are some of R K Narayan's books. The Blind Dog is a form of post-colonial literature, which is included in Malgudi, a collection of short stories written by Narayan. The Blind Dog was published in 1947, when India gained independence from Britain. It's interesting to note that Narayan had spent his childhood as a subject of Britain in British India, and that affected his writing style. In The Blind Dog, we've seen subtle jabs at the British for their exploitation of India at the height of India's nationalistic fervour. Through the story, we will come to see some of Narayan's criticisms and anger towards Britain, but as is Narayan's writing style, they are never outright and direct. To better understand the context, it is perhaps best to take a look at the title. The Blind Dog can mean many things, but most directly, it means that the dog is literally blind. But then again, remember that this is Narayan. His writing often holds a second, more significant meaning. Well, just what is this second meaning? We will explore this as we delve deeper into the story. But in order to do so, we need to take a look at the genre of The Blind Dog.
The genre of The Blind Dog is post-colonial literature, with specific emphasis on the themes of colonialism, exploitation, greed, and inequality. Other themes include unequal power relationships, necessity, freedom, influence, selfishness, and sympathy. Throughout the story, we will come to see these various themes influencing the blind dog and see how this affects the entire story. The setting of The Blind Dog takes place in a market. It also includes the surroundings of the market. The main characters are the blind man, the mangy stray dog, the perfume seller, and the old caretaker of the blind man. The story is also told from a more subtle narrative, with Narayan not outright telling the message of the story. This setting runs parallel to some 200 years ago, when the British first colonialized parts of India. The running narration of The Blind Dog also corresponds with the history of British colonial presence in India, and the following brutal repression of Indian aspirations of freedom. On the surface, it may only seem like a story about a poor dog, but upon closer inspection, we see that this mirrors the British presence in India. Remember how we said earlier that the story was about colonialism, inequality, and exploitation? Well, instead of explicitly stating what and when the British did, he put it into a story, and the different characters having different roles. In the market, there is a blind man who requires the help of an old woman. But for for basic necessities such as lodging and food. However, he chances upon a dog who becomes his companion and helps him as he begs for coins. However, once the old woman passes on, the dog takes on the role of her. But as the dog takes on greater responsibilities, he finds himself led by a leash, being forced to go where his master goes. Slowly, the dog finds his freedom slipping away as his blind master becomes more controlling and autocratic. His master also becomes more and more greedy, realizing he can use the dog to guide him around the market and in the process make more money than what he used to make while sitting on the floor. Eventually, the dog is cut free by a sympathetic perfume seller and once more becomes free. But driven by hunger and desperation, it is forced back into the clutches of the old man, who this time chains the dog using a steel chain as a leash. This highlights the dreadful irony of the dog's situation. No matter how badly the owner treats him, he still has to return to the old man out of sheer necessity, even after regaining his freedom. This is also the narrative of the British colonial presence in India, with them repeatedly exploiting their Indian subjects. We will come to see that as the story progresses. Narayan's opinion of the British rapidly deteriorates until we come to see them as nothing more than brutal oppressors. In short, the story starts off with the dog and blind man in a dreadful situation. And for a while, it seems that they are both mutually benefiting from each other. But soon, the blind man's greed throws this perfect coexistence into disarray. And the perfect balance we see is shattered by the rise of a cruel tyrant and the exploitation of a poor dog. This is a quote we took from the passage showing the change in relationship between the blind man and the dog.
The author does not tell this story from a specific viewpoint. Instead, he manages to properly illustrate what each character is feeling and thinking, although quite subtly and not at all directly. However, we can see Narayan's subtle hinting in the way he portrays the plight of the dog and the cruelty of the blind man, and how he hits out at the mistreatment of the dog. Through the story, we come to understand the plight of the two main characters, and firstly, we will sympathize with both the dog and the blind man. But as the story progresses, we come to see how the blind man begins to take advantage of the dog, and the equal relationship that brought them together is now broken by unequal power they both share. The previous sympathy we once had has been replaced by a bitter disappointment and anger. The characters also represent various elements in Indian post-colonial literature. The blind man, the British. Blind man is represented by the British that exploited the Indians in colonial India. The British could have just been any other ordinary character, but why a blind man? This is because Narayan viewed the British as men blinded by their greed in exploiting India, and as such was portrayed as a blind man. The dog. The dog were Indians who rebelled under British rule and only had to continue being under British rule as the rebellion was brutally quashed. Notice how the Indians are portrayed as an animal while the British are portrayed as humans. This just goes to show the unequal status between the duo and how in the eyes of the British, the Indians are no more than just mere dogs. The leash. The blind man was originally nice to the dog and had appreciated its help, but once it had the leash on the dog, which represented control and rule over it, the blind man began to exploit and abuse the dog, hitting it and taking it for granted. The perfume seller. The perfume seller represents the colonial powers, which were in the same time as the British were in the Indian subcontinent. Some of the colonial powers helped Britain to dominate India, which is represented by the giving of the leash in the book, while others strived to break British monopoly in India, which is represented by the cutting of the leash. In the first paragraph, in which the blind man and the dog meet, is seen in "It was perhaps an auspicious moment for starting a friendship." They met there every day, and the dog cut off much of his rambling to sit up beside the blind man and watch him receive alms morning to evening. This is merely a starting to the story, where they quickly become fast friends. The first major challenge as friends was when the dog and the man encounter the young village urchin who was the devil and a terror of the blind man. As seen in, among those who frequented this place was the village urchin who had the mischief of a devil in them. He liked to tease the blind man by calling him names and by trying to pick up the coins in a bowl. In response to this, the dog sprung on him and snapped his jaw from the wrist, and the boy extricated his hand and ran for his life. This marks the increase in the relationship between the duo, the high point of the story. But later, we will come to see a dramatic downturn in their relationship. Now the turning point in their relationship comes after the old woman, the caretaker for the blind man, dies. The dog has to now take on more responsibilities, as seen in life for the dog took a new turn now. He came to take the place of the old woman. He lost his freedom completely. His world came to be circumscribed by the limits of the white cord which the ribbon vendor had spared. He had to forget wholesale all his old life, all his old haunts. He simply had to stay on forever at the end of that string. During this change, the old man's attitude towards the dog also changes, using words like, "Rascal, want me to tumble down, have some sense," and "Don't whine, you rascal. Don't I give you your food? You want to loaf, do you?" Thereby highlighting the change in power relationships. Throughout the story, the British, represented by the old man, come to exploit India and her inhabitants, which is represented by the dog, more and more upon the realization of the untold wealth they could bring in. See this in the story where the blind man utilizes the dog to bring in more money, so much so that he could start lending it out. This is evidence then that rascal has started lending money for interest. I heard it from the fruit seller. He is earning more than he needs. He has become a real devil for money. This just shows the British greed, going so far as to exploit poor India for its own personal gain. and making the Indians suffer, as seen in long after traffic in the market ceased, you could hear the night step by the far-off wail of the tired dog. It lost its original appearance. As months rolled on, bones stuck up at his haunches, and ribs were relieved through his fading coat. This shows just how much India had suffered at the hands of British colonialism. The British colonialism and exploitation culminates in the Indian Rebellion of 1857, but the rebellion is quickly quashed. This is reflected in the story, where the dog, shortly after gaining its freedom, is forced back into the clutches of the blind man once more. Throughout the story, Narayan narrates the relationship between the British and India, blind man and dog, the ever-increasing unfairness of the relationship, highlighting the effects of British imperialism on India and her inhabitants. The blind man originally had a string leash on the dog, thereby representing the British East India Company, where Britain had a small control over India in trades and economy. But after the 1857 rebellion, changes were made, and when India, represented by the dog, ran away, the leash turned into a metal chain, which represented Britain gaining full control over India and started to more and more exploit India for its natural resources, as represented by the blind man abusing the dog and making it stay up all night just so he could earn more money.
So now, for lesson 4, we will be going through the literary devices and effects used in the story. First, there were metaphors used, such as the blind dog. This is a metaphor as the dog is claimed to be blind, even though it is not. The word blind is actually meant to describe the dog being blinded by the basic necessities needed to carry on living its life. This is reflected in the story, as after being freed and successfully escaping the clutches of torture and exploitation from the blind man, the dog in the end still returned to its master, although it knew it would have to endure the sufferings again. This is because it could not survive on its own, and although its master would give it the littlest of food needed to keep it alive, it was still an immense amount, one in which the dog could not get anywhere else by itself. Therefore, the dog was actually blinded by survival, sacrificing many things such as happiness and freedom just to earn it. This metaphor creates a sense of unexpectedness in the reader, as they would think that the dog is literally blind before realizing it actually isn't when the reader starts reading the actual story and not the title. After finding out that the dog is not blind like what the title suggests, the reader will then be encouraged and urged on to find out why the writer has actually named the story The Blind Dog when the dog isn't even blind, while think at the same time. Another metaphor used is mischief of a devil. The writer describes a village urchin's poor behavior using the metaphor mischief of a devil. This is because in the story, the village urchin would constantly tease and bully the blind man, even stealing the blind man's coins. Thus, the village urchin's mischievous behavior is being compared to that of a devil, which is known as an evil spirit, related to harmful things such as hurt, sufferings, and even death, which is the general representation of the actions of the village urchin. Therefore, this metaphor is used to describe the village urchin, for he gained happiness and satisfaction from the blind man's sufferings. This metaphor allows the writer to fully communicate the idea of how mischievous the village urchin was, as it uses the word devil, which is understood by many to describe and help the reader better understand the behavior of the village urchin. It also creates an image in the reader's mind on the village urchin, which simply cannot be done in the little amount of words used. It is therefore extremely effective and efficient. The last metaphor used in the story is devil for money. This metaphor is used to describe how the blind man had changed. In the story, the blind man, who was a beggar, had a taste of earning greater amounts of money through the help of the dog. Thus, he became greedier and greedier, to the extent that the dog was getting tortured. The word devil is related to hurt, sufferings, and even death, as I just said before, and therefore is describing the evil and torturous state the blind man has become due to greed. Just like the proverb, money is the root of all evil. This metaphor, just like all the others, uses a simple and understandable word in devil to effectively describe the state of the blind man. It also creates an image in the reader's minds on the blind man's change in behavior, allowing a greater understanding for the reader. There were also two similes used in the story: shouting like a bullock driver and shouting like an ox driver. These similes describe the manner in which the blind man shouted at the dog. In the story, the dog had to keep up with the blind man's extremely fast pace, being shouted as a sign to move on. The manner in which the blind man shouted at the dog was compared to that of a bullock driver, as well as an ox driver. This therefore suggests that the blind man shouts at the dog extremely loud and fiercely, showing no respect to his companion at all, once more showing the unfair power relationship between the two. Through the comparison with the bullock driver, the reader is able to understand better the manner in which the blind man was shouting at the dog. It also creates a vivid image in the reader's mind of the blind man shouting, making it even more effective. Onomatopoeia was also used in the story, such as snap and tap tap. Snap was used to describe the sound made when the dog hit the village urchin's wrist when he tried to steal the blind man's money. Tap tap was a sound used to describe the movement of the blind man and the dog, and it was used throughout the story, describing the sound made by the blind man's staff as he walked around. Onomatopoeia is used in these two circumstances to allow the writer to more effectively convey his idea on the reader on the sound created when the village urchin got bit and when the blind man walked around. It is extremely effective in doing so, as it creates an immediate auditory image in the reader's mind, allowing for greater understanding. Alliteration was also used in the story, such as shops, schools, hospitals, hotels, and did despairing. Shops, schools, hospitals, hotels was used to describe the areas in which the blind man went to collect and beg for alms. Did despairing was used to describe the look in the dog's eyes after it reunited with its abusive and torturous master. Alliteration is used in both examples to apply emphasis and draw the reader's attention to that section of the text. The alliteration, shops, schools, hospitals, hotels, combines the sharp S sound and the more gentle H sound to effectively convey the idea. On the other hand, the alliteration, did despairing, conveys emotion in the reader, getting the reader to take pity on the dog. Personification was used in the story in the form of knight stabbed by the far-off wail of the tired dog. This metaphor is used to describe the effects of the dog's wail. In the story, it was written that one could hear the wail of the dog in the distance, even long after the area had quieted down. The word stabbed in the metaphor is being compared to the effects of the wail of the dog in the middle of the night. It is usually related to one being attacked suddenly by something sharp. Partnered together with the fact that it was in the middle of the night, this describing the wail of the dog to be sharp and sudden, being able to be heard throughout the silence of the night. Therefore, the metaphor describes the effect of the fatigued dog's wail. This metaphor allows the writer to communicate the state of the dog's wail by comparing it to the word stabbed. It allows the reader to greater understand the type of wail the dog made. It also creates an image in the reader's mind, conveying the message even more effectively. Lastly, irony was used in the story by naming the dog Tiger. The dog's name is Tiger, but this is ironic because the dog in the story has neither the fierceness of a tiger nor does it have the courage of one. In the story, it is weak and meek, highlighting the contrast.
This is the end of our lesson. We hope you have learned something about the blind dog. Thank you.